In discussions about the value of human life, pro-life doctrine typically asserts that life possesses inherent and infinite worth, making any attempt to quantify it morally objectionable. Yet modern societies face difficult decisions involving limited resources, risk management, public safety, and restorative justice. These decisions require some form of structured valuation, such as the value of a statistical life, VSL, used by agencies like the US EPA to estimate how much people are collectively willing to pay for small reductions in mortality risk. In many policy contexts, VSL calculations commonly range from $1 to $10 million, providing a way to balance costs with expected reductions in harm. This creates a tension. The moral reluctance to price human life meets the practical necessity of doing so to prevent avoidable deaths and deliver fair compensation. This tension forms the basis for a significant internal challenge to certain absolutist interpretations of pro-life ethics. Is there a monetary value placed on a human being? Short answer: governments and economists do not set a price on an individual person's life. Instead, they use something called the value of a statistical life, VSL, a tool for policy analysis that estimates how much society is willing to pay to reduce the risk of one statistical death. It is not the value of an actual person. What is the value of a statistical life, VSL? The VSL represents how much people, individually or collectively, are willing to pay for small reductions in mortality risk. For example, if 100,000 people each are willing to pay $100 to reduce their personal risk of death by 1 in 100,000, that totals $10 million, interpreted as one statistical life saved. This does not mean a human life costs $10 million. It simply reflects the aggregate willingness to pay for small risk reductions. Typical VSL estimates. Different agencies and countries publish their own values. For example, U.S. federal agencies commonly use values from $1 million to $10 million, depending on context. FEMA, 2020, used around $7.5 million. HHS, 2025 update, lists a central estimate of $13.60 million in 2024 dollars. A systematic review of 120 studies found median VSL values of $5.3 m, $8.7 m depending on sector, health, labor, transportation. VSL varies based on factors like sector, income levels, and methodology. Why use VSL at all? Regulators must decide how much to invest in safety improvements, environmental protections, medical interventions, transportation safety, workplace standards. Using VSL helps determine whether a policy's benefits, lives saved, outweigh its economic costs. The US EPA and other agencies emphasize that they are valuing risk reductions, not people. Historical and ethical context. Attempts to assign monetary value to life go back centuries. Egg. The Anglo-Saxon wergild, a compensation paid to families of those killed. Modern methods are more abstract and ethical, focusing on risk and public welfare rather than valuing individuals. Bottom line: there is no single monetary value of a human being. What exists is the value of a statistical life, VSL, a policy tool. Depending on the agency and methodology, VSL estimates today commonly fall between $5 million and $14 million in the United States. This reflects societal willingness to pay for risk reduction, not the worth of any person. A pro-life person could object to the value of a statistical life, VSL, on several philosophical and moral grounds, none of which require rejecting risk-based policy tools, but which highlight deep concerns about what the numbers imply. Here are the most common types of objections. 1. Human life is intrinsically priceless. A core pro-life belief is that human life has inherent, non-negotiable moral worth from the moment it begins. Because of this, assigning any monetary figure to life can seem like reducing a sacred, inviolable reality to a market commodity. Even though VSL does not set a price on an individual person, the symbolism of putting $14 million next to a life can feel morally degrading. Objection: you cannot put a price on human dignity. Life is sacred, not subject to cost-benefit calculations. 2. It treats people as interchangeable statistical units. Pro-life ethics often emphasize the individuality of each human life, that every person is unique and irreplaceable. The VSL approach, by contrast, looks only at statistical risk reductions, not individual persons, treats one statistical life as an abstract unit, not a specific human beloved by family, community, or God. Objection: calling a human being a statistical life ignores the uniqueness of each person and reduces them to a number. 3. It risks justifying harmful or discriminatory decisions. A pro-life advocate may worry about how VSL values are used Policies that rely heavily on VSL may prioritize saving lives in wealthier groups, because willingness to pay scales with income. This can appear to imply that some lives are worth more than others. That contradicts the pro-life principle of equal moral worth for every human being. Objection. If the value of life depends on income or demographics, we risk saying some lives matter more than others. 4. It opens the door to utilitarian reasoning that conflicts with pro-life ethics. Pro-life viewpoints often reject forms of utilitarianism that weigh lives or moral goods against economic benefits. VSL is part of cost-benefit analysis, which is fundamentally utilitarian. If a safety measure costs more than the estimated VSL benefit, agencies may decide not to implement it. To a pro-life thinker, this can look like choosing money over human lives, even if statistically. Objection. Using cost-benefit analysis to decide whether lives are worth saving is morally unacceptable. 5. It may encourage society to think of life as transactional. Even if the intent is only analytical, the practice can subtly shift cultural attitudes. People may start to think of life as something that can be priced. This can conflict with a worldview that wants society to treat life with reverence, not calculation. Objection. Once we normalize putting a dollar figure on life, we risk changing how society values people. 6. It conflicts with the idea that all life deserves protection regardless of cost. A strong pro-life position often holds that protecting human life is a moral obligation, even when it's costly. VSL-based reasoning can imply some safety measures aren't worth it if too expensive. Some risks are acceptable if reducing them isn't economically efficient. To a pro-life person, that may seem like morally improper reasoning. Objection. You don't weigh human lives against budgets, you protect them because it's right. How someone might argue it's a conditionally demanded calculus. A person defending the use of VSL-style reasoning, while still affirming deep respect for human life, might say something like this. 1. We live in a world of limited resources, so prioritization isn't optional. They may argue, governments have finite budgets, finite emergency response capacity, and finite personnel. Safety interventions vary enormously in cost. To protect as many lives as possible, societies must determine which interventions save the most lives per dollar. This isn't because life has a literal price, it's because in it doing the analysis costs lives. Argument. If we ignore trade-offs, we end up spending too much on low-impact safety measures and too little on high-impact ones. That means more people die unnecessarily. 2. Risk profiling is unavoidable in any safety system. Every public safety policy, traffic engineering, workplace safety, hospital equipment standards, drug approval, implicitly uses risk profiling. How likely is a fatality? Which interventions produce the largest reduction in harm? What are the diminishing returns on additional spending? Someone defending the calculus might say. Argument. We're not valuing a person, we're valuing the risk reduction, so we know where our actions save the most total human lives. 3. Without such calculus, decisions become arbitrary and less ethical. If we refuse to quantify risk reduction, decisions get made by political pressure, emotion, or visibility, rather than effectiveness. This often harms marginalized groups whose risks are less visible. Quantified analysis can actually enhance justice, not reduce it. Argument. If we avoid measurement, policy becomes biased and we unintentionally value some lives over others, even if we claim the opposite. 4. Restorative justice also requires forms of valuation. Restorative justice aims to acknowledge harm, proportionally repair it, restore relationships, and reconstruct safety. This often requires quantifying lost income, medical costs, long-term disabilities, and regrettably, the consequences of fatal harm. Even courts must estimate compensation in wrongful death cases, not because life has a price, but because harms must be acknowledged and repaired as fairly as possible. Argument. Restorative justice can't function without some way to measure harm. A life may be priceless, but the consequences of its loss aren't. 5. The moral intention matters. The goal is protection, not commodification. Someone sympathetic to VSL-style reasoning would emphasize, the calculation's purpose is to maximize safety, prevent avoidable deaths, and allocate resources fairly. It is a moral tool, not a valuation of human worth. Without it, fewer lives would be saved. Argument. This is not about what a human being is worth. It's about ensuring our policies save the most lives possible with the resources we have. 6. Failing to calculate is itself a calculation, with worse outcomes. Refusing to quantify risk does not escape the moral problem. It actually worsens it. Money or manpower spent inefficiently in one area means lives aren't saved elsewhere. The no-calculus approach often creates hidden, harmful trade-offs. Argument. If we don't measure, we'll save fewer lives overall. That's a moral choice too, and a worse one. A possible summary statement. Someone might put it this way. We aren't deciding what a human life is worth. We're deciding how to save the most lives with the resources we have. In a world of scarcity, that calculation isn't optional, it's morally required. How VSL reasoning can be raised as an objection to some pro-life doctrines. A critic might argue that certain pro-life positions, especially ones insisting that no form of life valuation is ever permissible, run into practical contradictions when confronted with the realities of policy, risk management, and restorative justice. Here's how someone could develop that objection in a thoughtful, philosophically grounded way. 1. Pro-life doctrine says life cannot be priced, yet society is morally required to prioritize among risks. A strict version of pro-life ethics claims, all human lives have equal and infinite worth. Therefore no life can ever be subjected to cost-benefit trade-offs. But in real policy work, resources are limited. Safety improvements vary widely in cost. Ignoring trade-offs results in fewer lives saved overall. Government agencies explicitly justify VSL for this reason. Without quantifying risk reduction, they can't allocate limited resources effectively. For example, the US EPA uses VSL as a measure of society's willingness to pay for small risk reductions, not to value individuals, and US government estimates often fall in the range of $1 and $10 million as a statistical representation of risk mitigation benefits. Objection framed. If pro-life doctrine forbids any valuation, then it forbids the very calculations needed to save the most lives. 2. Pro-life doctrine rejects treating lives as statistical, yet real-world safety decisions must. Pro-life positions often emphasize the sacred uniqueness of each individual life, but safety analysis, highways, healthcare policy, pollution standards, must operate over populations, not individual identity. That's why policymakers refer to one statistical life saved, which comes from aggregating tiny risk reductions across many people. A critic would say, if society refused to use statistical reasoning, it could not regulate environmental hazards, workplace risk, industrial safety, or drug approval. Therefore, a blanket rejection of statistical life valuation is inconsistent with administering a modern society. Objection framed. If a doctrine forbids statistical treatment of life, it cannot guide public policy, yet society must engage in statistical risk management to prevent harm. 3. Pro-life doctrine insists that no life should be traded off against cost, but real-world justice systems must quantify harm. Even in restorative justice or wrongful death settings, courts quantify lost income, medical harm, lifetime earnings, compensatory damages. These quantifications do not claim to measure the value of the person, they measure the impact of the loss. Systematic reviews of VSL research note that such valuations vary by sector and context, but they remain necessary for consistent policy and compensation. Thus, the objection is, if pro-life doctrine prohibits all valuation, even consequential valuation, then it conflicts with any form of legally or morally required compensation for harm. But restorative justice requires acknowledging and quantifying harm in order to repair relationships and address losses. Objection framed. If we refuse to measure harm, even imperfectly, we cannot deliver justice to victims. 4. Without conditional valuation, pro-life doctrine risks unintentionally causing more harm. A strict no-valuation stance leads to abandoning cost-effectiveness analysis, prioritizing symbolic moral purity over real-world outcomes, making decisions based on intuition or emotion rather than actual risk reductions. Government guidance documents, e.g., HHS regulatory analysis standards, emphasize that VSL is used precisely to maximize public welfare and prevent loss of life given finite resources. Their 2025 update lists a VSL of $13.60 million, used to ensure consistent, life protective policy evaluation. ASPHHS.gov. A critic might argue, if pro-life doctrine rejects tools that maximize total lives saved, it inadvertently leads to more avoidable deaths. This represents a practical contradiction in an ethic that seeks to protect life. Objection framed. If a doctrine refuses necessary life-preserving calculations, it jeopardizes its own goal of protecting human life. 5. The objection summarized. A critic could summarize the tension like this. Pro-life doctrine says every life has infinite value and must never be priced, but real moral decision-making requires prioritizing risks, allocating limited resources, and quantifying harms, activities that necessarily rely on conditional, statistical valuations. By refusing these tools, pro-life doctrine risks becoming impractical, or even counterproductive to its own aim of preserving life. This doesn't defeat pro-life ethics, but it forces a refinement. It pushes pro-life thinkers to distinguish between valuing people, morally priceless, and valuing risk reductions, are harms necessary for justice and policymaking. How the practical need for valuation seems to conflict with certain readings of Scripture. The tension arises because modern governance requires conditional, statistical, and economic reasoning about life and risk, while some scriptural interpretations portray human life as possessing absolute, infinite, and non-quantifiable worth. This creates a philosophical clash. One system demands quantification, the other forbids it. Below is how someone might articulate that conflict. 1. Absolute sanctity versus conditional practical decisions. Some readings of the Bible or Torah assert that all human life is sacred, because it reflects the image of God, Tselem Elohim. From this standpoint, life has infinite value. No finite amount of money, resources, or risk trade-off can equal a human life. Thus, ranking risks or deciding which interventions save more lives is seen as morally impossible. Every life demands total protection. Why this conflicts with the challenge? Public policy must prioritize. We cannot spend unlimited resources on every possible safety measure. But if life is infinitely valuable, then any failure to spend all resources to prevent any death seems immoral. A strict scriptural reading, life cannot be measured, makes modern governance logically impossible. 2. Prohibition against treating life as a commodity. Certain passages in the Torah and the Bible condemn treating human beings as property, or using monetary equivalents to express their worth, except in highly regulated, context-specific ancient laws that themselves provoke interpretation debates. A strict moral reading interprets this as, human life cannot be priced. Human life is not interchangeable. Human identity is unique and irreducible. Why this conflicts with the challenge? Tools like the value of a statistical life treat lives as interchangeable risk units, because the goal is to maximize population-level harm reduction. This does not demean individuals, but it does operate at a level of abstraction that some religious interpreters find incompatible with sacred uniqueness. From this view, any statistical abstraction is morally untenable. 3. Divine sovereignty versus human risk management. In some theological frameworks, the timing of life and death is governed by divine will, not fully in human control, and not something humans should manage through cost-benefit calculations. Certain believers might see human attempts to quantify risk, especially mortality risk, as bordering on presumption, usurping divine authority, or implying humans can control life and death through budgets and policy. Why this conflicts with the challenge? Modern society must manage risk. We approve medicines based on risk thresholds. We set safety standards based on risk calculations. We regulate pollution based on mortality risk functions. The scriptural posture of life and death are in God's hands can clash with the civic requirement to simulate, measure, and mitigate risk through statistical tools. 4. Justice is inherent versus justice is measurable. Biblical and Talmudic conceptions of justice often rest on moral duties, divine law, human dignity, qualitative relational restoration. They do not typically depend on numerical quantification of loss, but restorative justice in a modern setting must estimate damages, measure harm, assign compensation. This is not pricing the soul, but it does involve pricing the effects of death or injury. Why this conflicts with the challenge? Some scriptural interpreters may argue that quantifying harm in monetary terms reduces justice to economics, risks ignoring deeper moral obligations, treats the harmed party as a bearer of financial value. Thus, the modern requirement for measured compensation can feel theologically inadequate, or even improper. 5. Infinite value versus finite budgets. Scripture-inspired ethics often express, every human life is infinitely valuable. One life saved is as good as saving the whole world, a well-known rabbinic principle. You cannot trade one life for another, a core moral rule in many Jewish and Christian traditions. But in reality, governments must choose which interventions save the most lives. Saving all lives is impossible. Lives are traded off, implicitly, if resources go to one risk reduction instead of another. This creates a direct contradiction. If life is of infinite worth, then any finite trade-off devalues it. Yet not making trade-offs leads to worse outcomes, meaning more lives lost. The challenge demonstrates that refusing to quantify leads to the very result the doctrine aims to prevent. 6. The core of the conflict. The objection highlights a structural tension. If Scripture is read as forbidding all forms of life valuation, then Scripture as interpreted becomes incompatible with the practical demands of protecting life in a modern society. The challenge shows that quantification is not optional if we want to minimize harm, but certain scriptural interpretations reject all quantification on theological grounds. Thus, the tension is not between religion and economics, but between absolute moral claims and conditional, context-driven decision-making required for governing and justice. Ultimately, the objection rests not on opposing the pro-life commitment to the dignity of human life, but on questioning whether that commitment can guide real-world decision-making without some form of conditional valuation. When governments must allocate limited resources, evaluate risk, or repair harms through restorative justice, refusing all forms of quantitative assessment can undermine the very goal of preserving life. Tools like VSL, imperfect as they are, help ensure that public policy decisions save more lives, distribute protections more fairly, and acknowledge the concrete impacts of loss. The challenge for pro-life doctrine, then, is to integrate its ethical convictions with the unavoidable practical realities of governing, without sacrificing either moral clarity or human welfare.